When I got to camp, the boys were behind trees with their guns ready, but I told them that Indians wouldn't follow us in the timber, for they knowed when we shot we got meat. Jim had his saddle off, trying to pull the arrows out of his mule. I roped his forefeet and throwed it and cut them out. I was a little careless when I let it up, for it made a bulge and away it went, looking back to where it had been introduced to the Indians. We never saw hide or hair of it again. Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. My name is Ian, and today I'm talking to you about George's Toward an Understanding of Storytelling Events. This is an incredibly important article. This is one that's personally really informed the way that I approach things. I use it in my own work a lot, make reference to it as if it were gospel. It's not the only potential reading, but it's a wonderful example of this shift that saw the end of the folklore as a kind of static discipline into one that was a fairly dynamic one, without disparaging the generations that went before it. You have to remember that this was written in the 1960s, so you have a whole bunch of counterculture and hippies in Southern California, and just a wash of new thought that was emerging, in part because of the long-term effects of the GI Bill, where you had this rapid expansion of people who had never necessarily been able to get into the academy and were bringing new perspectives, a lot of them having to do with class and race, to the classroom, and hell-bent on reimagining and reinventing what went before. So they were really pushing away from folklore as being an item-focused discipline to something that is being performance-focused, to the point where, as we're going to find out, the idea, bringing home that the stuff of folklore only exists in the moment of transmission. It really has no life apart from the fact that it is being re-performed regularly. Regularly revisited, but it's the revisiting that we focus on. It isn't the thing that gets revisited. There's no folklore without the active participation of the folk, and so this was a time of theory, and a time of trying to purify the dialect of the tribe, and therefore we have this article with postulates and diagrams and new, sometimes clunky terminology that's basically trying to do the thing that theory does, which is suggest an interrelated nexus of terms and relations to build models to describe the way the world actually is. And you can make an argument that this entire late 60s, early 70s period, it fundamentally revivified folklore as a discipline, and it became part of just the inherited wisdom, as it were. It became baked into the cells of the generation after that and the generation after that, to the point where, even though contemporary folklore doesn't always speak in this language of theory, it isn't necessarily trying to articulate in the way that theory often almost represents mathematics, we are fundamentally informed. These are transformative moments. And here's the problem that George is suggesting. The problem is that that for most of the history of the discipline, the 20th century research, the basic premise is that stories are surviving or traditional linguistic entities. And therefore the primary objective is to record additional story texts, study the content of these texts in order to discover what information they might convey about the history and nature of man and culture. And there's definite intellectual effort and definite insight that can be gained, but for George's, it fundamentally is a push away from what folklore actually is, what the stuff of folklore actually is. To it and viz, that there is no stuff that exists independently, but these are the points he's going to be building on. And he sort of divides them into two camps, and it's fair that folklorists, for the most part, were engaged in these collection efforts, in the development of tail type indexes and finding cross-cultural patterns that existed, identifying types, identifying motifs, and so on. Meanwhile, anthropologists sort of abandoned the historical approach and were more or less looking at stories on an individual cultural level and seeing how the stories represented the way that an individual culture understood the world. So basically looking at the stories only fundamentally for its functions. But still kind of thinking of these stories as inherited things that exist almost independent of the individual practitioners. So then he asks, well, fundamentally, what is the point of that with this question? The study of story, in other words, has yielded interesting comparative data and has provided corroborative evidence for the multiplicity of working hypotheses about the nature of society and the effects of cultural conditioning upon the individual and the group. But because it has existed primarily as a means of achieving predetermined ends, story research has made little contribution to knowledge in the 20th century. Because it's the predetermination of looking at these stories as remnants that have endurance independent of the folk themselves, it's all kind of superfluous. Rethinking has begun to reveal that the problems in story research are not really problems in perspective or approach. They exist because, that's the point I was making, because of the persistence of the premise that stories are surviving or traditional linguistic entities, and the a priori assumption that the means of discovering the meaning and significance of these entities is through the collection and study of story texts. And it calls into question that basic premise that stories are surviving or traditional linguistic entities, and that objective to record story text in order to compare and contrast. And that's what's been happening since the 19th century. So his argument is that the text, the words, are really just one aspect of the storytelling event. And as much as it is easy or tempting to collect these texts because they kind of resemble texts as we understand them through literature, and because they are the kind of things that can be committed to a medium easily, word to word, we have an abundant and simple way of taking the words that we speak and putting them down on paper. So of course we have language, we have the written word where we can take spoken word and put them down on paper and turn them into an object that we can actually look at and analyze. Remove it from the ephemerality of spoken to the fixity of text. But the fact that they therefore start to resemble something along the lines of a written text is almost an accident of history, and an actual storytelling event comprises so much more than simply the words. But we are basically, and George's argument is that we have basically been fixating on the words and the text, and therefore treating them as the same kind of enduring entity that we think of when we think of like a piece of literature, and that isn't the way that stories function. It's their fluidity that's important. So, he wants to make it clear, and he doesn't emphasize this point too much, but we'll come back and emphasize it, that whatever persistence the story has through time, it is not and he's very clear that he uses the word message as opposed to story, but whatever persistence it has through time, it's through the deliberate and conscious actions of the people, of the series of storytelling events that comprise the reperformance of that thing. That thing doesn't exist outside of that sequenced reperformance. So that is the point that he is trying to make. Now he uses the word storytelling event, and that might kind of scare you off, because once you hear something along the lines of a storytelling event, you might be thinking of something along the line of a festival or a session at your local library where someone who calls themselves a storyteller is sitting down and blah, blah, blah. And those kind of things that we might use the word storytelling event to describe, those are cultural performances, are the exception and they're rarities. And it's not that this model doesn't apply to them. It's just that we engage in storytelling events all the time in casual conversation, passing people by on the street. They are social experiences as well as communicative events. And occasionally they are very formal and reflective, but not all the time. So storytelling event is his term, clunky though it might be, for basically any time two people are talking and expressing something to each other. So let's go through, because it's lovely. He's got these 4 postulates. Every storytelling event is a communicative event. Every storytelling event is a social experience. Every storytelling event is unique. And storytelling events exhibit degrees and kinds of similarities. Let's go to that first one. A storytelling event is a communicative event. A message is being transmitted. He's using all these words from communications theory: message, encoder, transmission, and so on. Again, because he's trying to strip away much of the ambiguous language, but he's trying to really sort of describe what is actually happening, as opposed to what we imagine to happen. So there is at least one encoder and at least one decoder. Coding and decoding as these terms, and they are in direct communication with each other. It can, of course, mean face-to-face, and I think up until 1965 or 1968, when this was written, you would start to see this as, we'd still be using the language of face-to-face. By this time, we could be talking about, there were the beginnings of the discussions about sort of folk events over the telephone, but the idea is that they are in some kind of direct contact with each other. That at the very least, there is a flow that is bidirectional, that the encoder and the decoder are somehow present to each other, even if that being present to each other is through a medium. And so you can make an argument that it isn't simply synchronous mediums, like obviously face-to-face, but also telephone or live streaming, but even asynchronous ones like chat or like Marco Polo or something, where there is a back and forth, but there's it's asynchronous, but it kind of implies that level of synchronicity or synchronicness behind it. Anyway, obviously that's dealing with technologies that he didn't have at the same time, but you could make that argument. I would make that argument in a number of different ways, and how you can actually sort of push this forward into talking about things like comic books and the like, but let's just sort of stick to voiced events at the very least. And there is a coded message, again using the words of communications. They're linguistic codes, clearly. People are speaking in languages. There's paralinguistic, just like tone, like the pace with which someone expresses something. Perhaps the temporary assumption of an accent. Things that, going back to what he doesn't like, when rendered upon the page, you might be able to express a little bit with stage directions or punctuation. I mean, what is punctuation apart from some kind of repetition of, or some kind of a representation of the way that we interrupt the series of words with pauses and sometimes tones in terms of the question mark, and sometimes a volume in terms of the exclamation point, and so on, or italics or so on, and quotes when we affect some kind of different character. So we have those as markers already. As I'm making these videos, it's kind of interesting where I'm trying to take the captions and make them, edit them as I go. So I let YouTube do most of the captioning, and then I take it down. I take that file down and I edit it into something more appropriate, and and put it back up there. And it's just a stream of words. It's reading my words. It's one long sentence. And it's me to introduce things like capitalization and exclamation points and so on. So that's sort of one way of thinking about it. But of course, it's also not simply linguistic and paralinguistic, it's also kinesic. It's these things, it's gesture, it's tone. It's not simply my arms doing stuff, it's my face doing stuff. It's how I am looking back, it's how I'm not looking at you at any given moment, and how I am an embodied presence. And that you are reading my embodied presence and what I am doing with it, because you know that that indicates something. Some of those codes might not necessarily be intentional. This kind of random gesturing might just simply be emphasis, and you really interpret it as that he is being emphatic. Whereas I might be having a more minute gesture in terms of like tiptoeing across a room, where you kind of have that as something. I also might be making things like side eyes and stuff, where again I'm not necessarily even aware that I'm doing it, but you can interpret that how you are. So that's part of the event. And as part of the event, because we talk about side eyes and we talk about eye contact and so on, because it's not simply the encoder who is doing this, it is the decoder. A point that we get to as we progress is that there's a feedback mechanism. In fact, it's not, we don't have to progress too far. It's actually one of my next points, in that there are there is this response, and that as the encoder encodes the message and transmits that message using everything at his or her disposal, the ones that are appropriate for the medium, because obviously when you're talking over the telephone, even if you might be gesturing, you know that you need to be doing your voice as much as possible. And even if you are if you're communicating through chat, you've got to use all caps if you want to yell, and you can because yelling doesn't really do much for you. But there's someone else on the other end, and they are not wholly passive. They are responding in some ways, even if it is limited to maintaining eye contact. If you're listening, if you are telling a story and someone and the person you are telling that story to does this or this, you at least have some kind of message in return that you are being heeded somehow. You might not know all the subtleties. Maybe you needed feedback to actually be linguistic as opposed to simply kinesic, but you know that there is something, and you know that side eye, and you know that eye rolls, and you know that even just doing something like not dropping the attention paid is it's indicative of something. And if I see you do that, if I'm the teller in this, now we switched around, if I'm the teller and I see you do that, I might alter my performance somehow. So that feedback mechanism is critical, because it's the way that the audience actually informs and co-creates this event. It isn't simply the storyteller, it is the storyteller within a particular audience, within a particular storytelling event context, where there's a storyteller and there's a story listener. And those are the terms, rather than encoder and decoder, those are the terms that he talks about in the next section, where he moves from it being a communicative event to a social experience. Because of the many social identities that someone might have at any given moment, at the moment of the event, someone is assuming this role of not simply encoder and decoder, but storyteller and story listener, that pairing takes place. And so that is now something that the culture understands as having certain expectations in terms of the rights and responsibilities, a point that we're going to get to in a second. So the person who is talking and the person who is listening is, and I use talking to encompass everything in terms of the encoding of a message, encoding and transmitting of a message. the storyteller and the story listener comprise this matched set. And there's a critical point that he makes, and he makes it. It's one of the few points where he moves away from this set of postulates and sort of expands into a long explanatory section. And he emphasizes how important it is, but I still don't know if he emphasizes how important it is. And that is section, what's that? Postulate 2A point 2. And I'm going to read the whole thing, the whole parenthetical. The social identities assumed by the participants in every storytelling event constitute a matching set. The notion, and here's the important part, and then I'll talk some more. The notion that multiple social identities of a social persona are coincident during a storytelling event is extremely important and warrants some elaboration here. Whereas one individual selects the social identity of storyteller, and at least one other selects the social identity of story listener, thus making it possible for a storytelling event to be generated, those who select the social identities of storyteller and story listener also have other social identities that function coincidentally with the selected social identity of storyteller or story listener. If a man selects the social identity of storyteller and his son selects the social identity of story listener, for example, the social identities of father and son and man and boy are certainly relevant during the storytelling event and will even have important effects upon the choices that both the storyteller and the story listener can make during the course of that event. But as the storytelling event is generated, the social identities of storyteller and story listener become increasingly prominent, while the other social identities coinciding with these during the storytelling event decrease in relative prominence. So I think that point is clear, and that we don't exist in a vacuum. These social identities are just one of the many identities we have. So when you are talking to a friend, you are bringing with you all the ways that you understand that friend and the various relationships that you have, so that as they are telling you a story, you are bringing that context to your understanding of that event. And father and son example is clear, spousal example is clear, friend example is clear, and even things like perhaps other identities that aren't familially based or socially based, but much more institutionally based. For example, professor and student, teacher, boss and underling. When you are in a workplace, you have a whole bunch of often fairly hierarchically and rigidly defined identity pairings, individuals who talk to each other or who potentially talk to each other, who have an already extant nest of relationships with each other. But here's where it gets more interesting. That seems to suggest that storytelling only takes place among people who already have these extant relationships on the level of the individual and the specific. Whereas I think what's really important to bear in mind, and again, I don't think anything that I'm about to say undermines anything that Georges was saying in this, but I think it needs to be explicit, is that what happens when you are talking to someone who is virtually a stranger? What happens when you engage in this kind of act and you are bringing to bear the multiplicity of social identity pairings? So I'll use myself as an example. You watching this video, you don't necessarily know who I am. If you are a student, you might know me. If you are a friend or a peer or a colleague, you might know me. You might just come across me randomly in the interwebs. So, how are you understanding what I am saying? And there are going to be these social categories that are brought to bear on how you understand things, including such things as generational. My age, you're making some kind of guess. I never reveal my secrets, but you probably have a healthy understanding of approximately how old I am, and maybe I'm a whippersnapper to you, or maybe I am Gramps to you, or maybe I am peer age to you. but that's going to potentially have an impact, negative, positive, we don't know yet, on how you are going to interpret what I am saying. Male, female, assumption of gender identity, assumption of sex identity, assumption of class, perhaps, assumption of nationality. If you detect an accent, obviously, I mean, we almost always think that we personally are accentless, but I know that I have an accent, and I know that that accent can be distinct, and how you interpret that distinctiveness of accent is going to be one of the many filters that we have. Ethnicity. Colonizer versus colonized, colonizer versus indigenous. And I'm saying versus, not in a way that necessarily implies conflict, but in a way that at least implies some potential kind of contrast. So you are bringing to bear in this conversation all the social identity pairings that you have with someone, with me as representative of various categories, even if you don't necessarily know who I am. And that's one of the things that I've used this in my own work on stand-up comedy. What happens when a comedian that you don't know comes on a stage and starts talking, which is a storytelling event, and with the same kind of feedback mechanisms, everything that he's referring to. It's more formalized. And they might not use the word storytelling, but it's more formalized in that everyone knows that this person on stage has assumed the encoder role and will be talking this way. And there are certain responsibilities and expectations and rights that the audience as story listener / decoder has, and will be shooting it this way. But when that person comes on stage, and it's not the specific social identity pairing of father and son, it's just some middle-aged white dude on a stage, the audience is going to start to frame their expectations based on that. And you see that when you go back and you look at early performances by comedians where they are not performing themselves because they are not known to their audiences yet. And it is only subsequently, when their audiences become aware of who they are and anticipate this person not as representative of category, but as someone with a reputation for storytelling fluency and competency, whose biography you already know, even if it's only a performed biography, that they no longer necessarily have to frame themselves as in order to both address and then perhaps subvert the social identities that they might be projecting because of who they are as an embodied presence. It's no longer middle-aged white dude me, it's your pal Ian. And so next video, the social identity pairing is going to be ever so slightly different because you have this video to have some kind of understanding. And I don't want to talk about this sort of this understanding of me through videos in some kind of necessarily kumbaya sort of moment. But you will know me better by the end of this than by the beginning, than you did before you flick this on. And that is one of the points that he fundamentally gets to towards the end, in that because they are social events, they are as sort of getting to know another person. That's a little bit, again, a little bit sort of hand-holdy, but I think that's still accurate. He talks about the rights and responsibilities, which is a strange language to use, but I think the idea is that because an event is happening, and because people have more or less consented to the event in as much as they have allowed one person to assume this role of storyteller, and they themselves have assumed the role of story listener. They have certain expectations for what's going to happen, and we know what comprises more or less a good story. So as you read that, strange paragraphs he has 2B, 1A, and B. Maybe it's a way of looking at it this way. The storyteller displays competence at what comprises a good encoding and response to feedback, as assessed by the story listener who expects and rewards competence. That assessment is also informed by external identity pairings. For example, you don't judge the quality of a performance based solely on the quality of the performance, as it were. And you know this to be true because if you've ever heard a story from a child, they're terrible. Kids can't tell stories, but you listen and you assess and you are judging that criteria of competency on a sliding scale. And when a child tells you a story, you know that you throw down those kinesic cues for feedback, using his terms, like they're going out of style. Those paralinguistic, those kinesic, and those linguistic cues. Then what happened? Oh, wow. You throw yourself into there because that's how they're going to learn. So what comprises a good story? How do you encourage people? That's that feedback mechanism. So now, if your Uncle Gary comes in and he's telling a story exactly the same way as your little nephew Kyle, oh boy, Gary's got to go. But we still love Gary, don't we? But we can say, that's a terrible story, Gary, sit down, and the performance can come to an end. Georges doesn't talk about bad performances, but bad performances are a wholly fascinating area of inquiry. And it's only emerging in the past couple of years that people are looking at failed performances and bad performances because those weren't committed to text now, were they? We don't have many examples of those because we only really get the good ones. That's the good ones that get recorded. Now that everything's recorded, all of a sudden we have bad performances, and that teaches us far more in many ways than good performance. But I'm getting ahead of myself. He also says that storytelling events, they have social uses and social functions. And he's going to come back to this at the end. But he wants to distinguish between the two. The social use is as determined and articulated, rather, by participants. Why do you tell this story? We tell this story for this reason. And that's the use. The function is something that's determined through analysis. And the function is only ever a working hypothesis. They tell this story because they are trying to justify tribal sectionalism, or they're trying to justify the capitalism that might be present in the story. Why do you tell this story in this particular way? They're inculcating this value system, or they're reaffirming gender norms by telling this story. And that an argument might be in place, but it's only a working hypothesis. Whereas you can get a lot of sense from how the participants themselves understand their stories. He also talks about how every storytelling event is unique, and that's, of course, his crux, that everything, that a storytelling event occurs only once in time and space, never to be repeated. It occurs only once with a particular set of social interrelationships. That even if you go to bed and you tell your child a story, and then the next night you go into that same bedroom and you tell that same child that same story, they are two distinct events. They are distinct events in part because they are in series, in part because one has preceded the other, and in part because there is now a different level of interpretation that's happening. It's a different moment. It's a different day. And of course there's similarities. And but there's also distinction. It's pushing that to the extremis. And we'll get back to that in a second. Because every storytelling event generates its own unique systems of social and psychological forces which exert pressure on the social environment and upon those whose interactions create that social environment. He uses those terms a lot in the second half of the article, but basically he doesn't want to use this because it does have this sort of almost magical thinking aspect to it, but he's saying that storytelling events are transformative. that they change something. They change something about the teller, they change something about the listener, they change something about the individual, the relationship between the two, and they change something about the way that they mutually and separately understand the world. It might be just by a matter of degree. It's not that everything is an epiphany, but fundamentally, there is something different after than there has been before. So again, this is the it's an important consideration to grasp about the uniqueness of occasions. We're going to pull back from it in a few minutes, but think of the importance of that. The last of his postulates: storytelling events exhibit degrees and kinds of similarities. This is both an obvious one and kind of a strange one. So he says that a given society, because they exhibit kinds of similarities, they may group certain ones together. They may group certain forms together, which we might understand as genres, and they may group certain contents together, which we might understand as type. But it's only the group that are doing that is not the analyst's role, that the folklorist is not there to determine it. In a strange way, we know better. Folklore should respect that the society groups them, but shouldn't think in terms of either types or genre. Which is, yeah, it's an interesting one. We're going to get back to that point as well. So that's the series of postulates, and then he diagrams it. And I love the diagrams. They're crazy. You can kind of imagine him sitting there sometime with like a marker and, I don't know, oatmeal cookie or whatever the grad students in the late 1960s would have powered up when they were writing a story, writing an article, or writing a paper the night before an American Folklore Society conference meeting. So I got to get these diagrams done and get them to, I don't know, the wood engraver or however they would have done diagrams in the 1960s. Oh, look, the ageism just screams through me. So it's those amoeba shapes that sort of come together and like some kind of cell mitosis start hanging out with each other. But I do want to attract your attention to 7 and 8 as the text that he uses to describe them subsequently at the top of page 322. As the interactions of the storyteller and story listener intensify through their joint participation in the shaping of the message increases in prominence, relatively speaking, and begins to create its own tensions, which reach a peak as the message itself generates maximum interaction between the storyteller and the story listener. As the storytelling event comes to an end, its various aspects become indistinguishable, and the whole storytelling event generates its own unique systems of social and psychological forces that exert pressure on the social environment and upon those whose interactions create that social environment. Remember, I said those words we're going to refrain later. And I love that diagram 8, where all of a sudden the borders have disappeared, or the borders that distinguish the one from the other, the teller from the listener, the encoder from the decoder, disappear, and they're sort of coterminous with each other. There's something kind of orgiastic about that, and there's something that kind of might be described as communitas, that fundamentally the social identity pairings are important and relevant and critical and all part of this, and then at the very end they drop, and there is just the community. There's just undifferentiated usness, which is, again, probably doesn't happen each and every time. But the possibility is there. And you know when you have been in the presence of a wonderful story, where clearly the person who's telling the story has control of the situation. And they are the one upon whom subsequently the plaudits of, man, that was an excellent story, should be justly given. But in a way, you have just lost all sense of doing anything but being in the moment of storytelling, And the feedback mechanism is of ecstasy. Ecstasy in response to the text, and your ecstasy is making that text more ecstatic. Yeah, it happens. It does happen. I don't speak like this too often, but it does happen, and it's very fun. So now he goes to a section on the discussions. And he talks about the nature of stories. So, in a way, this is, sort of classic article. He sets the problem, he sets his new solution, and now he sees how his new solution addresses the problem. It's practically a quaestio. So, the nature of stories. It has been in the past, before Georges shows up and he saves the day, that stories somehow have an independent existence in time and space, persisting over an indeterminable time. And they resemble written literature, but only so far, because they are oral, thus both ephemeral and homeostatic, and they are told by people of lesser status who can't achieve literary complexity and aesthetics. So that is how we treat stories, because they are limited, apparently, in their expressiveness by being oral and by being something that the folks say. And he says no to this. And that first paragraph on 323, let me get to it. All of these notions are rejected and are considered irrelevant in terms of the concept of storytelling events presented here. The message of a storytelling event has no existence outside the storytelling event itself. You ready for a run-on sentence? It's not a run-on sentence, but it is a long sentence, so strap yourself in. It is not some thing that is merely used within differing contexts, for the message of a storytelling event exists only in terms of and because of the individuals whose selection of the social identities of storyteller and story listener entitles them to enjoy socially prescribed statuses, and whose choices among the alternatives prescribed by these identity relationships and status relationships result in the generation and communication of a message that is simply one aspect of an integral whole from which it and every other aspect of the storytelling event are inseparable. Oh, poetry. He goes on, but after a period and a capital letter. Furthermore, the messages of storytelling events are not communicated by spoken language alone. Indeed, they are multiply coded, and they take their shape as a result of coding choices made by the participants in the storytelling events in accordance with socially prescribed coding rules that are relevant during the course of these events. Though it is possible to draw analogies between written narratives and the messages of storytelling events, the same criteria cannot be utilized to judge both, nor can both be subjected to the same kinds of study and analysis. Finally, since storytelling events are communicative events and social experiences, they can be generated by the interactions of two or more people regardless of their social, economic, or educational statuses. There is nothing especially authentic or traditional about the messages of storytelling events generated by the interactions of the non-literate or the pre-literate, for storytelling events constitute one kind of communicative event within continua of human communication and one kind of social experience within the network of social interrelationships among people, irrespective of their relative social, educational, or economic statuses. Oh, how can you not love that? I can see why you couldn't love that, because you didn't have the benefit of all my paralinguistic flourishes that turned that rather thick thing into poetry. But that's what I'm here for, my lovelies. So, the nature of stories. They are events. They do not have that consistency over time that to the point where they exist independent of, which is the second point he makes. Where he talks about the processes of story transmission and change. Because it had been understood previously that storytellers, this idea of tradition bearer, which we hear a lot in folklore, and we hear a lot in music, and we hear a lot in traditional culture. And it's not a useless term, it's not a bad term, but it needs a hell of a lot of contextualizing. And it can be salvaged if it's contextualized the way that he's doing it. And to be fair to Carl von Sydow, who kind of came up with this term, I really kind of think the way that he would have meant it, but then has sort of been forsaken by subsequent generations. So storytellers had been understood as carriers or caretakers of stories, where their role is to reproduce accurately, with story listeners as receivers, some of whom will in turn accurately pass them on. And also, occasionally, their feedback mechanism is about correcting incorrect performances. And that variation, such as it happens, that the explanation for variation is basically accident, basically someone abrogating their responsibilities to perform something accurately. Like, no, that's not how it's done. And an audience that wasn't there to catch them. And I still think that, that sentiment is still very much alive and well. But he says no to that. He says, certainly, as an individual performs the duties prescribed by the social identity of storyteller, they formulate a message that grows out of messages stored in memory as a result of past experience. Certainly, people think that they are telling the story from before because the thing that they are recreating is created out of their own experiences of having told or having heard this story. That isn't the same thing as the story exists and gets passed along. And the structure or the content of the message of an individual storytelling event may be socially prescribed. Social prescription we'll get back to in a second. But the total message of any given storytelling event is generated and shaped by and exists because of a specific storyteller and specific story listeners whose interactions constitute a network of social interrelationships that is unique to that particular storytelling event. Excuse me. So the storyteller and the story listener are actively taking things that, yes, some of which come from their memory, but they are the things that are around them, including memories, and including expectations, and including social prescriptions about what constitutes an appropriate storytelling event in any particular moment. They are the ones who are creating it. They are not some weird passive conduit. You know, those sort of strange theories about biology, where the idea is that, for example, seeds. A bird eats a seed and doesn't digest it, and so poops it out, and from that, a tree grows. Things are spread through that. Now the question becomes, the sort of weird question, is that sort of symbiotic relationship where the bird both feeds from the tree but also helps the tree regenerate. Did the tree create the bird, or did the bird create the tree? Who is the active agent in this? And that's, in a way, kind of the model. In that it's almost like the stories are seeds, and the folk, the storyteller, just eat those seeds and poop them out. And it's like, oh, well, you did something, but really it's the seed that's important. And that is a tree perspective. And he's not saying that. Because that bird is not incidental. My analogy breaks down, but it's a fun one to play with for a while. It is not, the folk are not a conduit for the tradition, a tradition that exists. Because tradition doesn't exist. Tradition is only the immediate moment, collective and individual understanding of how the past is influencing the present, what is being brought forward. And that act of being brought forward is not the weight of tradition itself. It is the conscious decisions of many players, some of whom, of course, have different levels of power and access to what can go forward. But nevertheless, that kind of breaking down the idea of objects as being the cultural legacies as opposed to actions as being the the things that propel tradition forward. And finally, this discussion, the meaning and significance of stories. This is the longest of the concluding sections, but I'm actually going to sort of gloss over it quickly because, in a way, it's just a reaffirmation of the point he made earlier. Talking about the functions of stories is only really ever going to reflect the theoretical framework that you bring to it, and so you bring to a culture. So if you are if you have like a Malinowski idea of culture and he directs you to the reading, I'm not going to describe it, then the stories are going to fit into how you understand that culture to operate, and that their function is to redress balance, is to be metaphorical escapism from strictures or whatever. If you are talking, again, an example I gave earlier, if you are sort of doing a Marxist critique, one of the things you can talk about with stories is that how they're about hegemony, and that they reinforce these capitalist cultural values. There's a lot of them, and you might be right, but those are assumptions. Those are intelligently drawn hypotheses, but they are hypotheses nonetheless. So he wants to, and he especially wants to move away, and he wants to sort of take a leaf from what he considers good anthropology, is that even if that intelligently drawn hypothesis is valid within one particular context, it doesn't mean it's going to be universally applicable. So functions of stories are going to vary from culture to culture anyway. Uses, on the other hand, the things that the society itself interpret as relevant, interpret as why the story is told, are things to pay attention to. So that's what you should heed. Which leads me to something, a conclusion that if you have been reading this or following along and you kind of still feel a little bit wonky, I do want to assure you that we have sort of taken a step, not back, but rather sort of through and back. As if this is sort of the extremis. There is no such thing as repetition. And it's like, okay, well, we accept that. We think about these things as performances. We know that there is no organism called Cinderella, that it is only the moment of a collection of decisions where a storyteller and a story listener are engaged in an event, and that is one of the decisions that is made, is to that the message of the storytelling event is a message that they recognize as Cinderella. Is an important one to consider. And so but we pushed beyond this, because in a way what he was talking about is and that sort of leads me to back to this idea of the uses and how the group can sort of collectively understand them as gathered together, but we shouldn't. And I think the thing that he's making, and sort of the legacy of this, or rather how we sort of push beyond it, is that in a way he was suggesting that a story that gets retold, which is now contra his terminology, but just to sort of rephrase it in a way, going back to inside our language, a story that gets told again, a message that gets revived in a storytelling event. It's not incidental. And the idea is that these are important to the people who are present to the storytelling event. And we shouldn't necessarily, therefore, from that, conclude that this story is important in and of itself, independent of this. But the group understands this thing is important, and that is not simply an interesting piece of trivia. That is of prominence. That is something that we should actively consider. I think I sort of I phrased it when I was preparing my notes for this. Although the terminology isn't used, social prescriptions, the expectations for style and repertoire selection. If we think of things, of actually paying attention to these social prescriptions, what the group understands is appropriate as a content, and what the group understands is appropriate as a style. And important, appropriate in terms of, yeah, I want to hear this again. Yeah, this is meaningful to me. Yeah, I get something from this story. Yeah. Or, yeah, this is important for you to hear. Or this is important to me for you to hear. Or, yeah, I think you're going to enjoy this story. All those sorts of things. Allows us, let's take these social prescriptions seriously, and they allows us to turn around and now reconsider types and genres, not as fixed and enduring entities, but as ongoing negotiations of describable anticipations. And the thing to think of about a type and a genre, the thing to think of about how the amassed stuff, the thing that these old-timey folklorists have collected and analyzed and assorted and so on, in that it doesn't necessarily tell us what it does is that it informs the future. They are prospective. They're like, this is what has brought us to this particular moment. And we can sort of start to make some kind of the detection of patterns, that if this is the legacy of storytelling events, however poorly recorded, and we do need to pay heed to the fact that when we fetishize the words, we weren't getting the full dynamic of it, and so as we need to remember this. But if this is the collective remnants of previous storytelling events, all of that is somehow representative of the collective experience of the storyteller and the story listener as they engage, as they have that communicative event, as they have that social experience that is the storytelling event. That this is what they are bringing towards it. It doesn't condition, doesn't mean that they are not agents. It doesn't mean that they are beholden to it. But it suggests some kind of direction, some kind of history, and it's about the next story. So this isn't his language. But I don't think it necessarily contradicts, or if it does, maybe with a certain amount of nuance. And that if you think of this as a record, if you think of what folklorists have done as some kind of record, then so what? But if you think of it always about these are things that can be brought to bear in the next storytelling event, that these are about what happens when the next story is told, or what's in the background when the next story is told, that becomes kind of fun and dynamic. I cannot praise Georgia's storytelling events enough. So I was reading it in preparation for the video, and I read this regularly. This is the first time that I've sort of sat down to create all the files and so on, and so analyze it in the way that one's analyzing. I came across this great quote, in that reading for teaching is like eating for the aim of writing a recipe later. You're just doing it on a different level. But as I was reading this again today, I was just, man, there's so much in here. Man, there's so much that can be explored and built on. And of course, Georgia's did built on it, and a whole discipline has been affected by it. But anyway. Okay. Sorry, I'm getting all kind of emotional because I love this article so much. That was me, your best pal, talking about Robert George's Toward an Understanding of Storytelling Events. I bid you well, my friends.